Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent to call off the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to again bring up a very important issue. It's important because it impacts a major part of our lives, a major law that Congress passed several years ago. It's important because it goes to a fundamental principle, what should be a fundamental principle of American democracy, that what Washington passes for the rest of the country, it should live with itself. I'm talking about the Washington exemption from Obamacare and my effort with others to end that double standard. Now, Mr. President, as you remember, during the Obamacare debate several years ago, this issue came up in the context of a floor amendment, and was an important floor amendment, one of the very few that conservatives in the Senate passed on the Senate floor. That amendment to the Obamacare bill said that all members of Congress and our staff would get our health care through the so-called Obamacare exchange, just like millions of other Americans would under this plan. No special rules, no special treatment, no special exemption or special subsidy. That was important to say that Congress would live under whatever law passed for the rest of America. And that amendment was passed on the Senate floor. It became part of the broader bill, and it was eventually passed into law. Obviously, as you know, I strongly opposed, continue to oppose the Obamacare bill and the law, but that amendment was made a part of it. Well, after it was passed into law, it was sort of one of those cases of what Nancy Pelosi said. We have to pass the law to figure out what's in it. Because after the fact, lots of folks on Capitol Hill in Washington started reading the law more carefully and read that provision and said, oh, you know what? How are we going to deal with this? Surely we aren't going to be subjected to the Obamacare exchanges the same as millions upon millions of other Americans, even though that's exactly what the statute said. Well, at that point, a very determined lobbying campaign got underway, lobbying campaign of many members here on Capitol Hill of the president. And the campaign was simple. People rushed to the administration, rushed to President Obama and said, oh, you need to change this. We can't live with the statute that said, and the significant section of the statute that says all members of Congress need to go to the exchange for their health insurance, just like millions of other Americans. And sure enough, after months of that very determined and sadly bipartisan lobbying campaign, President Obama issued one of his countless executive orders and edicts to essentially change, with a stroke of his pen, contrary to statute, a significant part of the Obamacare statute. He's done that dozens, if not hundreds of times, and this is one significant example of that. He changed what the statute said and took a lot of the sting out of that provision of the law for members of Congress. And through an OPM rule, he said two things. First of all, members of Congress, when you go to the exchange, which is mandated, don't worry, you're going to have a big taxpayer-funded subsidy follow you to the exchange, unavailable to every other American at our income level, completely unique to members of Congress. No other American going to the Obamacare exchanges enjoys this, but out of thin air, we're going to give you a big taxpayer-funded subsidy that is nowhere in the statute. And then the second significant thing President Obama did through that OPM rule is say and members of Congress, this doesn't have to apply to your staff, even though it says it does. You can designate whoever you want on your staff as quote unquote non-official, and they don't have to go to the Obamacare exchange at all. Well, Mr. President, virtually all of my Republican colleagues regularly come to the floor and rightly complain about President Obama changing statutory law with the stroke of his pen, acting beyond his authority. This is a crystal clear example of that. And if we complain about it in other contexts, I think we should speak up and complain about it even when it benefits us. And so that's what I'm doing. We should not stand for this Washington exemption from Obamacare. We should not stand for this complete double standard. We should insist that we live by that clear language of the Obamacare statute so that every member of Congress gets his or her health care on the so-called Obamacare exchange, just as millions of other Americans do. No exemption, no special subsidy, no special treatment in any way, shape, or form. And I've been fighting since that OPM rule to make sure we do exactly that. There'll be a floor amendment this week, again, to pursue that end. And I urge my colleagues to do the right thing, to support that important floor amendment. And it's important to do that for two reasons. One, focused on principle. One, focused on real practicality. First of all, the principle. I think it is a basic, fundamental principle of American democracy, certainly should be, that what Washington passes on the rest of the country, it lives with itself. That should be a fundamental principle of American democracy. And so my legislation, the No Exemptions for Washington from Obamacare Act, the floor amendment, which embodies exactly that legislation, would say that every member of Congress and the president and the vice president and their political appointees get their health care from the Obamacare exchanges just like millions of other Americans. No special exemption, no special subsidy, no special treatment, no special insider deal. And the second reason we should support that is a lot more practical. And that is, when you make the cook eat his own cooking, it often improves dramatically. When you force the chef to have every meal out of his own kitchen, the product often improves dramatically. And so that's what I want to do in a simple, straightforward way, abiding by the clear language of the Obamacare statute itself. All of official Washington, every member of Congress, the president, the vice president, all of their political appointees should have to go to the exchanges for their health care, just like millions of other Americans who have to as their fallback option. And we should do it in the same way. No special exemption, no special subsidy, no special treatment, no special insider deal. It's important we say this. It's important we do it. And we have an opportunity to do it here on the floor as we debate the bill before us. And I urge my colleagues to support this important floor amendment and to lend support to the freestanding bill that I've introduced. As I travel Louisiana, I have regular town hall meetings. I have regular telephone town halls when I'm stuck here in Washington voting. Probably the single biggest complaint that I hear that really and rightly gets under the skin of my fellow Louisiana citizens goes to the heart of this discussion. Why the heck does everybody in Washington think they're above us? Why do they pass laws and never have to live under them themselves? Well, this is a crystal clear example of that. And what's worse, the statute itself sets out that we would live under Obamacare, getting our health care from the Obamacare exchange, just like millions of other Americans. If you don't believe that that's what the statute mandates, look exactly at the particulars of how Congress and the President are currently getting around that through this special OPM rule that President Obama issued. This rule says that Congress can get its health care from a special small business exchange in the District of Columbia and can have a huge taxpayer-funded subsidy apply, even though it's unavailable to every other American at our income level. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, under the Obamacare statute itself, that small business exchange is specifically set up and regulated and limited to small business, 50 employees or less. How did Congress define itself as a small business with 50 employees or less? It's interesting, if you pull the paperwork that the leadership of the House and Senate sent over to allow members to participate in this exchange, the folks who submitted that paperwork on behalf of the House and the Senate, who signed off on it saying everything contained therein was true and accurate, said, how many employees does the Senate have? 45. How many employees does the House have? 45. Really? Interesting. That is a flat-out lie. It's a flat-out lie submitted in writing by the House and Senate on behalf of all of us to shoehorn Congress in to this small business exchange to get extra added benefits, to get this taxpayer-funded subsidy unavailable to every other American at our income level. And that proves how outrageous this end run around the statutory language is. So again, Mr. President, I urge all of our colleagues to come together in support of this fix, to say, yes, it should be the first rule of American democracy, that what we pass for the rest of America, we live by ourselves. And that's important, and we're going to do it in this case and in every case. I urge my colleagues to support our freestanding bill, the No Exemption for Washington from Obamacare Act. I urge our colleagues to support the floor amendment, which is the same as that freestanding bill, to pass it as a floor amendment, to pass it into law through that mechanism. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Excuse me. And, Mr. President, before yielding the floor, I would ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be equally divided.
Without objection.